Good morning, everyone. I'm John Handy, Communications Director for the House Republican Caucus, and I'd like to welcome you to our media availability. With us today from the House side are House Republican Leader J.T. Wilcox, Representative Drew Stokesbury, Ranking Member on the House Appropriations Committee, and Representative Andrew Barkas, Ranking Member on the House Transportation Committee. And from the Senate side, we have Senate Republican Leader John Run, Senate Republican Whip Keith Wagner, and Senate Republican Deputy Whip Ron Muzal, also ranking member on the Senate Health and Long-Term Care Committee. And with that, I will turn it over to Representative Wilcox for some remarks.
Thank you very much, John, and thanks again to all of you that are here. And one more time, I'm really looking forward to when we can be in the same room together, and I hope that that day is approaching. We had something that I haven't seen a lot last night. We went through, I think, about 4.5 hours of debate on amendments on a tax bill, and then the gavel banged. No warning to us, and they decided that they would continue final passage theoretically at 11 o'clock today. I don't know when we will actually get started. That start time that we hear about is often a little theoretical. I am sure that they will go ahead and pass that bill. And then the rest of the session, I think, some things we know, some things we don't. What we do know is that there's a threatening storm front full of new taxes coming our way, almost all of them in the way that they impact people, especially people that have to commute. Very, very regressive in spite of the rhetoric that you hear. And that's the reason that we brought Representative Barkas and Representative Stokesbury to provide as much detail as possible on those things. And then later this week, I hear through the press that a budget will come out on Saturday. I think you know as much about that budget as we do, unless Representative Stokesbury can enlighten us with any details that he's gleaned. And we will then, I guess, vote it out on Sunday and bang the gavel. And unfortunately, we will see this session end with almost no action at all on emergency powers. We thought that we had a pretty good stress test on that topic. We thought that there were the possibility of some worthwhile adjustments. There were a lot of bills proposed very early in the House, never once got a hearing. And same thing happened in the Senate, although I think that there was a hearing on one of those. Big disappointment to us, because we think a lot of people would like to have some clarification of when emergencies end. We have no clue when this one is going to end. It could be still here when we come back for the next session. Back to you, John.
All right, well, thanks, JT. I think you covered the highlights that are going on right now. I mean, some of these, it feels a little bit like creepy. We're still working on how do we get safely reopened and get our state government to look, not only get the measures right, but understand how different measures are more important over time. Right now, we should be focusing on what's happening with the fatality rate. And hold on a second, my computer's trying to update right now. There, fix that. And yet we still are focused on case rates. It doesn't make any sense. So we've shown a lack of flexibility there. We need to find ways to get our economy reopened and maintain the jobs around the state. We still have huge inequities around the state in getting kids back to school. We've made some progress there. We should acknowledge that, but there's still a big difference between rural and urban schools, and has a lot more to do with the strength of the teachers union in those areas than it has to do with what's right for kids around the state. And then this is 101st day of session, 417 days since we declared the emergency. And we don't know what the budget looks like. Looks like we won't know what it looks like, the operating budget, until Saturday, the day before we're supposed to shut down. And again, 417 days, and we've yet to have a serious discussion on emergency powers. And that is not a political or partisan discussion in my view. That's simply recognizing the lessons we have all learned over the last 417 days and applying them to the statutes that allow truly representative government as this continues. And we don't step right back into one-person rule next Monday when there's no legislature around. And we did, to JT's point, we did get one hearing on a business reopening bill. We have not had a hearing on an emergency powers bill in the Senate either. So this has been a complete, kind of hands off. We can't touch that topic because we can't buck the governor, or we can't change the system even a little bit based on what we've all learned over the last year. So I'll stop there. We have a couple relatively new members on the call today with Ron Mazzal and Keith Wagoner. They haven't joined us in the past, so we're happy to have them on. I think they'll bring additional insight as to what's going on here in Olympia. Back to you, Kim, or John.
All righty, let's go to questions. And we will start with Rachel LaCourte from the Associated Press.
Hi, good morning. There is a lot pending in these final days, as you all noted, the budget being one of them. But even with the capital gains tax, which it sounds like the House will take up final passage at some point today, it goes back to the Senate with language that I know you all are concerned about as it relates to whether there's an opportunity to have a referendum. In the Senate, how do you think that'll be received, considering how it got out of the Senate in the first place? And given that there's likely to be a lawsuit on this anyway, I mean, is your expectation that, is there another route for the public to go, I guess, if they wanted to challenge this, like, for example, by initiative? And I mean, just sort of what do you see sort of the pathway for this measure as it heads back to the Senate?
Oh, well, that's a complicated question, and I'll do my best to answer it in a kind of, at least in part. First of all, we will strongly oppose the addition of the emergency clause language, and they try to hide it so it doesn't look exactly like emergency clause, but it's virtually verbatim out of the Constitution, trying to take away the right of referendum. I think that's just fundamentally wrong. I'd like to believe we have the votes in the Senate to not concur and push back on that. We'll see. That's going to be a big issue over the coming days. The majorities clearly are committed to passing this bill, but the idea they're going to take away the right of referendum is just wrong. I don't think when you look at the numbers, I mean, the alternative is an initiative. I'm not sure there's the time to get this on the ballot in an initiative form this year, which means the court challenge, which there's sure to be one, will go forward and we'll see what happens there. But I'm actually kind of wondering if the majority stop through this, do they really want an income tax on the ballot during the 2022 cycle? I suggest to them they ought to think through that a little bit more. But the idea of limiting the people's right to a referendum is frankly just wrong.
Hey, Rachel, I'd like to answer that from another angle as well. And first say it's nice to see you here. It's been not as much fun without the AP at our press conferences on some occasions. But your question was really good because you went through all the insecurities surrounding this tax, the possibility of initiative, the possibility or not possibility of having a referendum. You mentioned that it would likely be challenged in court, and also the possibility that it doesn't survive in the Senate. I'd add a couple more. First of all, it's the most volatile tax, almost that it's possible to create. It goes after a small number of the most mobile people in the world. And it also takes effect such a long time from now that there's going to be a large number of transactions, if it is passed, so that the capital gains can be captured before the tax goes into effect. At the same time, if you followed the debate on the amendments yesterday, you would have heard from the other side that this was funding absolutely the most important things that there are in our state. In fact, at one point, one of the debaters on the other side belittled all the rats and cats that are funded in the regular operating budget. Why on earth, if these things are so important, if they are the most critical things, as we heard over and over last night, would a revenue source with as many uncertainties and challenges as we've all heard this has be relied upon to fund the most important things? I think it really reveals just how insincere this whole effort to pass the bill is.
And if I can jump in as a co-chair of the tax structure work group, addressing the timing of this, because we're supposed to be working together in the tax structure work group to come up with some agreed to solutions at the end of the year and into next year. So why drop this bomb right in the middle of a process that our side entered into in good faith to come up with solutions? We recognize the tax code isn't perfect, but there should have been a bit of a hiatus on radical changes while the tax structure work group is trying to do its work.
Rachel, did you have a follow-up?
I'm all set, thanks.
Okay. All right, next we will go to Austin Jenkins of Northwest News Network.
Thank you, John. My question is just looking ahead. I know there's a lot still up in the air for these last couple of days, but I imagine that we will be hearing Democrats and the governor describing this as a historic session. And when you look at the, maybe not the volume of bills, but the significance in terms of policy change that has come through, whether that's the package of police bills, whether it's a capital gains tax, presuming it passes, restoring voting rights for people coming out of prison, the driving while suspended bill. I mean, on and on and on and on. Lots of bills that some that were new this year, some that have been around for a long time and haven't passed. And suddenly there was an opportunity for Democrats to get them through, and they did. So they will no doubt say this was a historic session. What will your review be? How will you look back on this 2021 session?
Well, I think it depends on the next 5 days. But if many of the bills that are teed up pass, I would agree it's historic. We've never seen this many tax bills, ever. We have never seen so many bills, especially when you look at the bills that impact the cost of commuting. And remember, people of modest means often live a long ways from their job because that's where they can afford housing. And when you look at the bill upon bill that adds to the cost of commuting, it will be a historic session in the sense it could not be more regressive if those bills pass. It could not weigh more heavily on working families and the middle class. Yep. That's not the kind of history that we ought to be making. And I hope in the next 4 or 5 days, a lot of those bills don't pass.
Austin, good question. Good not to, I guess I can't see you, but that is probably what makes this a historic session. It is the quantity of the policy. It's the breadth of the policy, the substance. Some of the biggest issues I think we've seen in our state. Of course, as Representative Wilcox said, the tax policy, but the fact that we're doing it in a virtual environment, the fact that we are not allowed to be together legislating at the Capitol building with the public there, with our stakeholders, with others, with our LAs, doing all this in a virtual world, just like we're doing this press conference today. I think that's the historic aspect of that. Senator Braun said 417 days, I think it was, or 417. You know, this entire legislative session, day 101, and here we are, we're still not in the building. Some are, but we're not there together. So that whole dynamic has been missing this entire session. In the transportation arena, I think the historic aspect is the fact that we're trying to see for the first time a partisan transportation revenue package being proposed. A slate of regressive taxes that have been proposed both in the Senate, primarily the Senate package that's moving, and the House, but a package of transportation revenue that is so significant and goes on for so many years, but none of us are at the table from the Republican side. So our reforms, our ideas, none of it's being considered. So that's historic, where you look back at every other transportation revenue package that's been put forth in the history has had a bipartisan element, and one that we can work together and stand together behind. I'm not sure if that's going to come to fruition here in the next 4 days. I would be shocked if it did. They're trying, but I think that is something that will resonate with the people in the state because we've just had no input on it at all.
Do you have a follow-up, Austin? Okay, Austin, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to talk and you couldn't hear me. Just Senator Braun, briefly, can you offer a couple comments about the session thus far?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a lot different to say than what JT or Andrew had to say. I mean, yeah, there's some big bills out there. I think it's just the opposite of what we recommended to the majorities at the beginning of the session, given the limited access and the limited ability to talk among members in both chambers, to talk to stakeholders from around the state. And yes, you could watch in your living room. You could even testify in your living room, but you can only do it for 30 to 60 seconds. It just really is the wrong time, given the limitations on access that the majority parties have insisted on to do the types of heavy issues that we're working on, certainly in the very partisan way it's been done. And I think that's one of the things you're going to see. And I too hope that it doesn't play out like it looks like it's going to, but I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to work out that way. You're going to see when you look at the bills that come out of the session, look at the partisan nature of those bills, I think that is going to be historic. That it has been a more partisan session. There's been less opportunity to work together to find middle of the road solutions to these important problems that are before us. And again, whether you're talking about our police reform, which we've been willing to enter into, just not have been willing to take the highly partisan or one-sided view. Whether you look at the tax issues, hard to imagine the number of taxes that we've proposed this session, and I'd like to think they won't all pass, but I suspect a significant number of them will, and with fairly small public input. And I just think that's what's going to stand out as historic. That this was the wrong time to do some of the stuff we did, and there are things we had to do in session, but even the thing we had to do most, the budget, we aren't going to know about the details of the budget until day 104. Of a 105-day session. That seems just wrong, frankly.
All right, next we will go to Joe O'Sullivan of the Seattle Times.
Yeah, question for the leaders, and Representative Wilcox, you touched on this earlier, and Senator Braun, you just did a little right now. It sounds like you've been given no assurances by Democrats on when they'll release a final budget deal. Just can you confirm that? And what? In a more perfect world, when would you like to see a budget public?
I would just say I expected, based on what I was hearing in terms of the negotiations, and again, we aren't hearing a lot, but that we would see a budget made public today or tomorrow. That's what I expected. I mean, it's not going to work where we're going to have. I didn't expect a week. I didn't expect 2 weeks, but I expected, 2 or 3 days at least to have what could be less than 24 hours is just hard to imagine. And, when you look at the two budgets that were proposed a few weeks ago, they weren't that, they've spent way too much money in my view, but they weren't that far apart. To have to hold on to the very last day is frankly shocking.
If I could just add to Joe, House Republicans and Senate Republicans both took the unusual step of releasing our own minority budgets quite early in session. And we did that for two reasons. Primarily to show the public just how possible it was to fund all of our priorities and then some without raising taxes. And both of those budgets were released before we had a revenue forecast that brought in an extra $4 billion and before we knew about the latest federal ARPA funding. But a secondary goal of that was to show also that there's a better way to do budgets when you're in the minority in Washington, rather than trot them out the week before cutoff, run them on the floor and pass them in a week, and then go behind closed doors in conference and come up with a conference report the day before Sunny Die, which is what's happened every year since I've been here and what's happening again. We thought maybe a better way was offer budgets early in session, allow the public plenty of opportunity to look at them and comment them and point out the strengths and weaknesses, So I think if you saw Republicans in charge, things would be a heck of a lot different, not just substantively, but also procedurally, and give a lot more meaningful opportunity for the public and the press to review 55 to $60 billion in spending and provide input on it.
Joseph, I would just add from the transportation budget, I've been involved in the budget cabinet all session. We do it different, obviously, than the operating budget. The chair and I worked together from day one to write the budget. And then we've been in conference for the last 2 weeks with the Senate, our Senate counterparts. And effective last night, I'm hoping it holds, but about 11 o'clock, I believe we have the final negotiated deal on the remaining differences. So that should be proposed or go to paper today or Thursday. So I'm not sure the schedule of when we will see that run out to the floor, but unlike the operating budget, I do have insight into the transportation budget, and the compromise, the work between the Senate and the House on the current year budget was good, and it's a good product moving forward. So I am confident about that.
Joe, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, Republicans have had a tough session here. You're in solid minorities. You're not getting input on the budget. The fence is still up. Emergency powers legislation went nowhere. What is the best you can hope for in the final days of the session? Is it just that some of these deals among Democrats between the House and Senate fall apart and fewer things advance? Or are there any things that you can do here in the final days to obstruct legislation or get a little more leverage for things that you want to see in the last days of the session?
Well, I think the demands of many of the progressive groups that are the constituents of the majority party are so immense and often so conflicting that there are some opportunities in the last 5 days for segments of that caucus to use the fact that we are a solid minority because we're able to stick together when it's important. And it may be that some of the things that are on their wish list that we don't think are good for the economy or good for the people that we represent will go by the wayside because of the splits in that coalition.
Yeah, I would specifically highlight the low carbon fuel standard and the carbon, and the cap and tax program that have been proposed. These are bills that we're moving forward in large part because some folks felt that was the only way to a transportation package. It doesn't look like a transportation package is in the works for the next few days. And those bills we've demonstrated pretty clearly are enormously regressive, not particularly effective at reducing carbon emissions, and wrong for the state of Washington. So I'm going to push for it, and I'm hoping that we can set those aside this session and perhaps work together on something that works better, both for our environment and for the folks around Washington that would be just crushed by these new regressive taxes in the name of carbon reduction.
And let me add one more thing. I think that the number one concern that I and most of my caucus has, because we represent people that live in less urban areas because that's where they can afford the housing. They often have families and they often have to commute long distances because that's where the economy is, in urban areas, away from where they can afford housing. The nightmare for people like that is that we have a gas tax on top of an expensive LCFS, or as some people called it, the high cost fuel standard, and a very expensive cap and tax. It could not be more regressive for working families. And because of that, although I've never been someone that said no to transportation packages, I think that's an important component of building a solid economy. Those are hard assets. But if you multiply all those things and stack those three costs on top of each other, you could be talking 60 or 70 cents a gallon. And we have talked about this in our caucus. I think one of the things that's important that we let you know right now is we don't have any votes for transportation bonds in the House Republican caucus right now. It might be different if they were considering, just one package at a time. But when you are crushing hardworking people with all three of those things, I don't think House Republicans can support that. And at this point, I'm 100% sure that we don't have any votes for the bond.
All right, next we will go to Sara Gentzler of McClatchy.
Thanks, John. Senator Braun, a question on the Blake bill. Can you talk about the work that went into the compromise that passed off the Senate floor last week, and whether you would still support the bill if possession was knocked down to a misdemeanor from a gross misdemeanor?
Sure. So that's a complicated topic. And as you know, it came off the floor of the Senate in a very bipartisan and frankly, somewhat unusual way. But that was the path to get at this policy. And I think it's really important. And many folks, frankly, on both sides of the aisle, I believe, think that this is something we have to address so that our local governments have clear statewide policy on how they deal with the possession of hard drugs. And there's a group out there that want that to be fully legal and no restrictions. And what we know is that gives us no real path to treatment. And that's, I think, if anything, is the binding aspect of effort on this is a recognition, certainly on our side of the aisle, but I believe on both sides of the aisle, that we have to create a system that gets after treatment. We have some concerns even with the piece that passed off the Senate floor, that because you no longer have the Class C felony charge, you don't really have access to the Superior Court, which is where our drug courts reside, and not everybody in the state has therapeutic courts at the community or the district court level. So it creates a challenge, frankly, for treatment. That said, talking to law enforcement and prosecutors around the state who almost to a person, I'd say to a person, are also much more focused on how do they get these individuals to treatment rather than putting them in jail or prison. They say they think they could make it work with a gross misdemeanor. I think we got to get something done. I'm not saying no to anything, but here's the challenge. The reality is when you talk about diversion, some folks that works for, but a lot of folks it doesn't work. You have to have some leverage to get folks in and committed to treatment. And a misdemeanor gives you 90 days. Sometimes you can double that to 180 days to keep folks in treatment for 100 days, but that's not enough in many cases. Whereas the gross misdemeanor gives you 364 days. You could double that. You could get kind of some leverage to keep people in treatment for a couple years to make sure they really get their lives back together. And if you can do that without a felony charge, and it makes it easier for them to live a long and fruitful and productive life, well, that's good as far as I'm concerned. I think the misdemeanor is troubling. But we're going to talk about it. Maybe there's a stair-step path. I don't know the right answer, but I know we remain committed to get it done right. And there's a point at which it doesn't do anything or does something bad. In the current bill, I think being considered by the House is like one of the earlier bills in the Senate where it sunsets and leads to full legalization. I think that's just absolutely the wrong answer. That's bad for these individuals. It's bad for our communities, and it won't help us deal with the problem. I'm not saying we had it right before. I made this statement before. I think our war on drugs in many ways has been a failure, but I don't think we throw out everything. There's things that we know have worked and that we need to get after solving this problem. So I know that's a lot to throw at you, but it's a complex problem and one I hope that will work in a bipartisan way over the next few days to address statewide.
For the House, I'd like to defer to Representative Barkas. It's not his policy specialty area, but it's one that he's been very productive in.
Thank you, JT. I appreciate Senator Braun's work on this and the work that was done in the Senate. Because Senator Braun and I have some shared life experiences in our families with this. This is important, and I think the important component out of this particular piece of legislation is the roadmap to treatment. And I think that, as opposed to the decriminalization of possession of illegal substances, those substances that are killing so many of our citizens in the state of Washington, is not the right way. But the component that deals with treatment, from detox to treatment, to time, to recovery housing, and to pathways out of there, is the area that we should be focused on. That is where our resources should be. Now, when it comes to the intent of somebody that you are working with, and maybe they're in a homeless encampment, this is another area that we've been working on, and you go to that person and you try to offer them, and they say, yes, I want help. But you find out that they are holding possession of these drugs, or they have a criminal background. they can enter into the court system and is there in our criminal justice system that I would like to see more emphasis on treatment and recovery and a pathway there and an opportunity to forego having those charges placed upon them in the future. And I think if somebody commits to that and gets through the process, not to have that specter of a felony hanging over them when they enter or they exit the other end of the program is a huge benefit, and one that I completely agree upon, because a lot of times, when they get to the circumstances, they don't want to continue to do the drugs anymore. They have to because of the power of the drugs. They don't want to. So this is something that I'm going to continue to work on. I know Senator Braun's going to continue to work on. I don't know how this final product, this is a very complicated piece of policy. We haven't seen it in the House yet. We will be talking about it, and we'll see what comes out of it and what pieces that are able to do the best.
Sarah, did you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so yesterday, after former officer Derek Chauvin was convicted in Minnesota, the governor and several of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, sorry, sounds like appropriations is starting on my computer. Okay. After that happened yesterday, the governor and several of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle reacted with both hope for the future and calls for continued work on police accountability. I haven't seen any statements from your caucus leadership. Maybe I missed something, but I'm just curious if you have a response to the verdict and what it might symbolize or mean for your work here in Washington.
Well, I would say that the positive thing that happened yesterday was a jury of American citizens unanimously came to a verdict. It wasn't politicians deciding, it wasn't Twitter, it wasn't the press. It was the process, the way that we all understand our system of government works. And if we've had any ray of hope, I think, in this arena, it's the fact that the process that has been handed down to us can be this effective under this kind of stress. That is such good news. And I think in this case, the process restored hope for a lot of people.
Yeah, I would echo what JT said. I think that our criminal justice system dealt with a tragic situation and the way it was designed to work, and it worked. That's good news for everyone.
All right, next we will go to Jerry Cornfield of the Herald.
Good morning. We've been talking about Blake and some other issues that are not resolved. I'm wondering, is there any issue that you think is so important that you would want to go to special session to get it right rather than try to wrap it up in the next 4 days?
No.
Agree. Everything that really has to be done can be done in the next 4 days, 5 days.
Well, I would absolutely agree. It absolutely can be done. I'd do an extra day if that's what it took to do emergency power reform. I don't want to go through this much uncertainty again. I don't want to be counting down 700 days of emergency with no legislative oversight for the major part of those powers.
I think we've accomplished a lot. I think we have time, if the time is managed properly by the majority here in the next couple of days, to finish what it is. I will say, I do want to say, I'm very pleased with the work that was done in the Senate on Senate Bill 5160 to end the eviction moratorium and to provide much needed assistance for housing providers and tenants in the state of Washington, and a myriad of very good programs that are in place. That bill is now heading to the governor's desk, where we will see what further actions are taken on it. And I'm confident in the form that it hits his desk is the form that he requested as we work this legislation through, and it's an example of what we did get done during this time frame here as tasked.
Jerry, I just want to echo JT's comments. I would be happy to stick around if I thought we could work in good faith with the other side of the aisle to kind of fine tune, I would say, the governor's powers. If there was one thing I was certain of coming into this session, and which is why you should not use me as a crystal ball, I was absolutely certain that we had support on the other side from conversations that we had in the interim, that we were going to come back here and do a better job crafting emergency powers that work. And I'm not a person who thinks we ought to be carte blanche taking powers away. Those are important executive powers for real emergencies, but they just went too far, and we've all seen the effect. I was absolutely certain we had people on the other side who were willing to work on this problem, and I was oh so wrong, and am very disappointed with that fact. But I'd be happy to stick around if I thought we could get to the bottom of that issue. It just doesn't seem like that's going to be a real hope.
Jerry, did you have a follow-up?
No, I'll hold on. I see other folks are probably waiting.
Okay. Next, we will go to Laurel Demkovich from the Spokesman Review.
Thanks, John. A question about the virtual session. I believe Senator Braun said that there hasn't been as much access, obviously, for folks who want to kind of get their voices in. But I think we have seen that, at least with remote testimony, there have been a lot more people from at least like Eastern Washington who have been able to kind of get their voices in, say how they're feeling about a certain topic. So can you talk at all? Is that something that you've also seen? And is that maybe a positive effect of this remote session that we have?
So the Senate has, for many years, been pushing the aspect of remote testimony. So that but we already had that before this year. Now we're better at it, and we should acknowledge that. But that doesn't get after the problem I was commenting on. It is important and valuable to have folks from all over the state, especially those far away that can't reasonably drive to Olympia, have the opportunity to testify. I would tell you that when it's limited to 30 or 60 seconds, and you're often cut off halfway through your testimony, sometimes unfortunately abruptly, that is not all that valuable, and that's a disservice to our citizens. So we can and should do better there. So there's things we've learned from this process that we should incorporate in the future. But I also, my comment was there's a limited ability to interact with other legislators, to understand their concerns, and often what you see, you can turn a partisan bill into a nonpartisan bill just by having the chance to have, those conversations with other legislators, to explain your concerns about second and third order effects of legislation before us, to talk to stakeholders in person. One of the most powerful things, and not to discount the power of remote testimony, that has certain value. But when real people show up in person in a committee and share their experience, there are few things more meaningful to legislators than that. It's just the way it is. And you don't come to Olympia expecting that, but I think everybody has the same reaction. When real people show up and share their challenges, that is very influential, and we just haven't had that. So the combination of inability to talk in person, as things work through the process has hurt us, and the inability to connect with people around the state in person, I think, has hurt us. So that was the root of my comments, and that's not to take away from remote testimony, which I agree and have agreed for many years is a very important tool as we work to solve our challenges in the state of Washington.
Yeah, this is Drew Stokesbury, Laurel. I would agree with what Senator Braun said. I think Republicans have, for as long as I've been here, been trying to push for as much remote testimony as possible. I think that the key distinction is that we always suggest remote testimony exists in addition to in-person options. I think the problem is that is now the sole method. That doesn't mean it's a bad method, just that there ought to be multiple options. If you can't drive or can't get enough time off of work, you should be able to offer testimony from remotely. But if you are so passionate about an issue that you need to tell your story to legislators in person, you should be able to do that too. And I think that's what we've missed this session.
Laurel, did you have a follow-up?
I'm okay for now, thanks.
Okay. Next, we will go to Keith Eldridge of Como TV.
To get my camera working. I want to follow on a question regarding the policing bills. A lot of them have already passed. Still a couple in conference. I'm understanding they might come out on the floors on Friday. What are your thoughts on how you've done with police reforms and not a lot of bipartisan support? Are you concerned that police are going to be too handcuffed to try to really deal with serious issues?
Yeah, I think this is a place where we've ended up with very partisan solutions to a real problem that we should be addressing, and we need to be thoughtful about this. Is there opportunity for police reform? Absolutely, and many of us, where we've had a chance to work on a bill and support it and make it better, have willingly and enthusiastically done so. But a lot of the bills have been, from the very beginning, strongly one-sided, not taking input from across the spectrum, and I fear that they're gonna undercut the ability of our law enforcement officials to do their job in a way that's safe for them and safe for their community. So I think we've swung too far, and we're going to end up with very partisan solutions to a challenge we should all be thinking through and addressing thoughtfully.
Well, I would say that this session had some interesting moments, and a lot of them had to do with moderate Democrats and Republicans working together to, take these bills and move them towards the center, not as far as we thought they should go. I've said so many times that we think that we have to preserve the tools that are necessary to keep us all safe, and then make it as unlikely as possible that the tools can be misused. They're passed mostly, and the rest probably will pass. We are going to feel the effects. And the truth is, I think one of probably the biggest things that are going to happen over the next few years is we're going to see if police are afraid to, take any chances that in some cases might save people or property. And we're also going to find out whether or not people are willing to stay in that profession and new people are willing to go into the profession. And I hope that there is a lot of openness to adjusting if we find that we've made some mistakes. I reached out via email to one of the freshmen in the House who had been very active in this legislation and thanked him for his sincerity, and also said it was plain to me that sincerity meant that we could work together in improvements and adjustments in the future. And I think we all have to be ready for that.
Keith, I think the policy that we've seen coming from the other side of the aisle really emphasizes the rural-urban divide in the state. So what we're seeing are reactions to problems that occur in urban areas and not even in our state sometimes. Across the nation, we are reacting to things we see in urban areas with a blanket approach that has an effect now on the entire state, where we don't have the same issues, we don't have the same problems. And I think that's not a good way to do business, particularly with something that's important as public safety and supporting our police officers. And although there has been pretty much partisan votes, there's a few bright spots too. And I would give credit to Senator Tawana Nobles, who sponsored a bill that kind of gets at the data. There's a study, because we don't really know what our problem is. It's not well formed. People are reacting to what they see on social media or a meme or a video they saw. But honestly, we don't have good data for Washington State, and her bill will start to develop that data so we can work on this problem from a common set of ideals and really know what our problems are and how we can best affect them. And when that data comes back, I would like to see an approach that is metered to the area that the solutions are meted out to. I mean, little tiny towns that I represent don't have a lot in common with Seattle and Tacoma's problems, but we're getting all of their bad solutions heaped upon us.
Do you have a follow-up, Keith?
Yeah, it has to do with COVID, and we were talking about metrics that are being used right now. I talked to Senator Gildon on Monday about his effort to get a bill be last minute, and I don't know if there's any effort to get that done, but to basically triage counties that are in jeopardy of moving back a phase. And Pierce County, frankly, is in jeopardy of moving back to phase 1. Lewis County, it should be in phase 2 right now because of the metrics, but they won't be re-evaluated until May the 3rd. What's your thought on getting Senator Gildon's measure to the floor, and also the effort of the governor? And you say the metrics are wrong. You know, what should we be doing? Because all these counties, King and Snohomish, are also poised now to go back to phase 2.
Yeah, specifically what I was getting at is the continued reliance on case rate rather than recognizing we're in a different situation than we were a few months ago, certainly different than we were 6 months ago. We have a vaccine that's being rolled out reasonably effectively now, and we're making good progress. You know, our most vulnerable folks over 65, I believe, are 75% vaccinated. That's a huge issue. We've significantly reduced the mortality threat from COVID. We now are in the middle single digits on daily death rate. And while that is tragic, that is not an outlier from other causes of death around the state. So we should be looking, case rate is less the important metric now, in my view. Fatality rate is the important metric, and available hospital beds are kind of something we should be considering. So my concern is just, and we've done this over and over throughout the crisis, is we are always fighting yesterday's challenge. We look at what mattered a month ago or 6 months ago instead of looking at what matters now and why our situation is different today than it was a few months ago. And that's a source of frustration for me. And we're constantly, our data is always 2 or 3 weeks behind, and that's well acknowledged by the Department of Health. And now, not even though even if we were to accept that is time late, we're looking at the wrong part of it and making our decisions on the wrong part of it. And then to Senator Gildon's bill, that was simply an effort to say, look, if that's how we're going to do it, let's not take counties like Pierce, like Lewis historically, who have gotten less, kind of a pro rata, lower share of the vaccines, and continue. Let's say, hey, let's get them back to at least the state average in terms of the availability of vaccines. That makes I think a lot of common sense to people to say, if you have a problem area in the state, let's get more vaccines to that area, or at least as many vaccines as other parts of the state.
All right, next we will go to Drew Mikkelsen of King 5. Are you there, Drew?
Yep, sorry about that. I know Joe asked earlier about the biggest hopes that you have in the final days. I'm going to flip the half full glass of water and ask what your biggest fears are. And if possible, I'd love to hear from all the members on the call. So I know we're tight on time, so you can keep your answers short. But what are your biggest fears? An amendment, a bill, a new issue that might come up, the budget? Let me know.
Well, I'll start. My biggest fear, Drew, would be that they try to ram this transportation package through. I just think that it would be precedent-setting, nonpartisan, or non-bipartisan, and with all the tie-ins to the carbon environmental policies and everything else, I think it would be a huge detriment to the people without the great benefit that it's touting. So that would be my fear, that they would try to do that. My hope would be that we could work on that between now and the next session and get it right, and something that we can all agree upon and present it that way.
Quickly, capital gains with an emergency clause that keeps the people from weighing in. A budget that comes out on day 104 that's overstuffed, that has a bow wave that is unaffordable in the future. And then the legions of new and regressive taxes that are out there, just, one vote away from becoming, potentially becoming law, and making it harder and harder for those already struggling economically in our state.
I would say mine is that the emergency powers are just going to continue, and we're going to redefine what emergency means going on and on and on in state. Essentially, we could be in a permanent state of emergency here because we have no mechanism to get out of it. And secondly, the fact that our kids aren't getting back to school across the state as they should be, as this thing is drawn out. I think we're going to see unanticipated, or some of us have anticipated, but untold damage to this group of kids for the year now that they have been out of school. And I hope that we fix that quickly, and that my fears are not reasonable, but I think that they are.
I guess I will jump in here. My fear is sustainability. And I guess being a farmer, that's something we consider in everything we do. But when I look at the numbers over the last 10 years of our state, our budget has almost doubled. Our population is up just shy of $1 million, but our per capita spending by state government has gone from $4,600 to $7,700. And yet our problems seem to get worse. That's not a sustainable model. You can't spend more and more and get less done and stay in business long term. And that's my fear of Washington State. Unless we figure out how to do more with less, we're going to end up in a hole we're never going to get out of. And this budget is another perfect example of that.
Yeah, Drew, thanks for the question. Continuing on the budget theme, because that's the committee I deal with the most. I would acknowledge that both the House and the Senate budget individually had a few good components. And so my biggest fear is in their negotiations with each other, the results of which won't be released to the public until perhaps the day before we adjourn. And if practice is the same as it was the last 2 years, won't even be released to the minority members until the day before. My fear is that in the negotiation between the two majorities, they negotiate away the good things that were in their budgets individually to pay for each other's less savory items. And so two separate budgets that had a couple good items of savings and modest efforts at sustainability go away in order to afford to buy each other's other projects in the budget. So that's my big fear.
Well, I like to talk about worries, I guess. I don't like to talk about fears, but I would say my biggest worry is the full meal deal of all three major carbon and gas taxes and regulation schemes that pile up on working families that commute. That to me would be the biggest regressive disaster we could contemplate.
Did you have a follow-up, Drew?
Oh, great. I appreciate the answers. Thank you.
Okay, the last question comes from Hannah Scott, who is having mic issues, but she wanted me to ask it for her. Are you able to ask a question for me? I'm looking for comment on emergency clause being allowed to stay in the open carry bill.
I'll just say one more case where there's just this desire to not give people a chance to have their own voice. I think that's unfortunate.
Okay. And her follow-up question was, can anyone weigh in on the conference for the police tactics bill and the issue of tear gas?
Yeah, I think that the issue, and this was well articulated by Senator Hobbs in his a couple different floor speeches, was the very real concern that the inability by both law enforcement and the National Guard to use that in crisis situations could lead to real physical harm for folks. And I think his concerns were genuine, heartfelt, and based on real experience. And I I'm optimistic that the conference will address those concerns and include those, and hopeful that, you know, it ended up in one of the bills in a way that was maybe not as effective as it could have been. I'm hopeful that it'll come out of conference in a way that recognizes his plea for thinking this through more thoughtfully, and does it in a perhaps more artful way.
Great. I think we got to everyone's questions, so I would like to turn it over now to the leaders for any closing remarks. Representative Wilcox.
I'm just glad to see everybody, and would be happy to continue doing these as often as you want during the off season. I think this kind of communication is important, and I'm glad that we have this opportunity to have a back and forth conversation. And it's not like so many of our hearings where you get 60 seconds and no chance to answer.
Yeah, I'll share JT's thanks. I appreciate the entire session. I want to thank both Ron Mazzol and Keith Wagner for joining us. They haven't had a chance to participate this year, and it was good to hear from them. And I do look forward to hopefully doing this more after the session ends. And the last thing I'd say is just a humble apology for not having the courage to wear my corduroy jacket on the last media avail.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And please be on the lookout for information on our next media availability, which is tentatively planned for Monday. Thank you, everyone.